All right, so we now are going to paint the apple. And this is the apple that is next to the banana on the very top of the box. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start just with our base color. So your base color is whatever is going to dominate the object. So in this case, we're going to work with red. So I'm going to paint the entire apple red with the exception of the stem. Now, with apple, it's very important to form the apple. So, if you are creating brush strokes that are maybe kind of similar to a beach ball, like what I'm doing right now, that's the direction you're going to want to paint with all of your brush strokes that you're going to use on this object. Now, with the apple, it's in front of the mango, it's in front of the grapefruit, and it's slightly hidden behind the lemon. So, because this apple is in front of the grapefruit and the mango, you want to make sure that you cover up any little slip ups or errors on those two objects so it looks like that the apple is in front of those. So I've got a little bit of space here. We're going to try and cover that up with paint. So, like I said, we're going to cover all of the apple with red, with the exception of the stem. We are even going to cover the little circle that we drew that designates the darker shadow or the darker kind of divot in the apple. And since this is a smaller area, remember to just hold your paintbrush with your fingers on the metal portion. That way you have the most control over the brush and what you're doing. And if you need to, if you're feeling a little clumsy, definitely get a smaller brush or one that has a sharper, finer point to it, as that'll help you control some of those marks. Okay, so now I just need to put a little bit of paint around the stem. Okay, there we go. All right, so now we need to make up our shadow color. So in this case, we need to mix the complement of red, which is green. So we're going to mix some red and green together to create the shadow color. And the shadow at the bottom portion of the apple is pretty dark. So this red and green mix can only get so dark. So I'm going to take a touch of purple and mix it into this to push it a little bit darker. So that way it still has the red and green hues in it, but the purple is just going to push it to that darker realm. So now I'm going to set down some of this dark value that I just painted in. And then I'm going to get my base, which of course is red. And I'm going to blend this red into that darker shadow or the darker value that I just created. So about half of this apple is covered in shadow. So it is pretty dark. So if you feel like your paintbrush marks or the darker shadows going up a little high, that's fine. It does go up pretty high up, pretty much halfway on the apple. And I'm going to get a little bit more plain red and kind of go along the edge here to help that blend in. So unlike the banana and the mango, we're just working with a few colors here. We're not introducing kind of a mix of colors like what we did with the mango. So make it a little more red and blend it into this top portion. Got a little too dark. Just need to add some paint right here. All right, there we go. Now it's blending how we want. Now, before I move into my highlights, I'm going to add my darker value in the middle where that stem sticks out. Now, this is a smaller area, so I'm getting a smaller brush, going back to the same dark color, and we're just going to add that dark color around the stem in the middle portion. And with this darker area of the apple and on the painting, it does blend in just a little bit. So we'll go to back to this brush that had some red in it. I'm going to take this dark value and just blend it out. Move it into the rest of the apple. And we're going to touch that up a little bit just to kind of push it a little darker. So I'm adding a little more violet. Now, for our highlight, this could be pretty similar to the grapefruit in that we're really going to create two highlights. So we're going to create a lighter highlight. Just going to touch up the shadow at the bottom a little bit. So we're going to create a lighter highlight, and then we'll create the bright highlight. Just this time, we're not going to use stippling at all. We're just going to use normal paintbrush strokes. All right. Just going to touch this up a little. There we go. Okay, so for your highlight color, we're going to take just a touch of white and red. And we don't want this to be super pink. So that's the one thing we want to avoid. It's going to have elements of pink, but we don't want it to be overwhelming. And I'm going to take this and got to make sure that we curve our paintbrush strokes. Just going to do that small amount right there. And I'm going to get another brush without any paint on it and put a little bit of red on it. Then I'm going to blend this red into that highlight that I just set down. what we're wanting. We want this kind of upper portion to be brighter, not super bright, but it does need to be a little bit lighter than the surrounding areas of the apple. So again, this will really help showing our light source and showing that this is a three-dimensional object that's round. And then there's just a little area right here. So we're going to lighten this up, and then we'll add a brighter highlight to this portion too. And we're just going to fade that into some of that dark area, just a little. Okay, so for the really bright highlight, I'm simply going to take white, and that was a paper towel. I'm gonna clean my brush off. I'm gonna take white and just a touch of yellow. And the brush still has a little bit red in it. Touch of yellow, blend this in really well. Yeah, too much red, it's messing up my color. Okay, let's try this again. We'll do white, tiny touch of yellow, don't really need too much. And then for this, I'm just barely going to touch my paper with the paintbrush. So what's important about this portion is make sure you're curving these marks. And there's kind of a lighter highlight that's right here. And then we do have a bit of a highlight in this area. Now there's a little bit of yellow that kind of pops up. And because that highlight isn't super bright, I'm just going to use another brush. It doesn't have any paint on it. I'm just going to kind of touch that to there. And then kind of touch the outer edges of this brighter highlight that I set down. And then I'm going to add just a little more of that white on top of it. So since I'm barely touching the paper with my paintbrush, I'm getting some of those brush marks, which helps because that helps show the curve of the apple, just kind of based on that highlight. Now there is a kind of a secondary highlight back here that has a little bit of yellow in it. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to very lightly go over this portion. And then I'm going to go back over it with my brush that doesn't have any paint on it. Just kind of like dabbing at it, just real light. Go back over it one more time, just barely skimming the paper with that brush. Now I'm just kind of looking at where there's some other like lighter areas that I can paint. And just some lighter values. I'm going to put some right in this area. All right, so now let's look at the stem. However, I think I'm just going to darken that shadow at the bottom a little bit. Like this looks okay, but I have this highlight that pops up here, which doesn't make any sense because the lemon would be blocking the light. So that's why this highlight is very important to have on there. So I'm just getting a little bit more of this green, red, violet mix. And I'm going to go over the edges right here. Because this darker shadow is really important because that is really going to help the apple look 3D. Because right now, as it is, my apple in this painting is looking kind of flat. Then I got a little bit of red to help it blend into that shadow that I just set down. Not too much, but just a little bit. And after that, we'll look at the stem of the apple. All right, so we're gonna let that dry, see how that looks. And in the meantime, we'll make the stem color for the apple. So for the stem is a brown hue. So we can mix two complements to get that brown value. And what you can see in the photo, there's a more of a reddish hue to it. So that would just tell me I'm gonna use red, a little bit green. We're gonna mix those together. Let's see how that looks. Turn my palette so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to take a little more red. So that red will help brighten the color a little more because as it was pretty dark. And I'm just going to spin my brush to get that kind of point back. It's a little more defined. Paint area where the stem would be. And now I'm going to mix in, or actually not mix in, but get a little bit of white. And this is going to be really detailed. So just a touch of white to make that tint. And there's a little kind of mark right here. So I just barely touch the brush to that area. Then there's a little mark at the bottom. And I'm going to put just a slight highlight on the top of the stem. So it's pretty abstract looking, but it still conveys the idea that the stem of the apple. Then I'm going to take just a little bit of my darker colors, and I'm just going to put kind of a dark speck of paint right in the middle right there. And I'm going to darken the area around the stem just a little bit. So that'll help create more contrast. It'll help the stem really stick out. And that contrast will allow the stem to be more noticeable. All right. And I'm going to touch up the bottom portion of this just a little. Get a little red. We're going to blend this in. So I'm just wanting to touch up this bottom portion. That's why I'm going back over it. Now, the last thing I really have to do is the shadow underneath the apple. So can't forget about that. That'll help give the apple a place. And for the shadow color, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the banana. So the surface is green. So we want to take green plus red and mix it with a touch of violet. But I can't seem to stop painting the apple right now. So like I said, we're going to take green plus red, a little bit of violet because the shadow is pretty dark. So these are colors that we've already been working with. There we go. All right, so green. So I'm really just making more of the color that I already have. And we need the shadow pretty dark, so I'm mixing in quite a bit of violet. And spinning my paintbrush to get that point to it. And I'm just going to go along the edge here. So notice how the shadow is formed. So what happens is it kind of sticks out about here. It has almost like this ellipse type into it. And it continues over here. And then it fades out just a little bit. So I take a brush that doesn't have any paint on it. Just gonna get this some paint right there. So I'm using a brush without any paint to kind of get this more feathered type appearance, except I accidentally erased some of the paint. We don't want to do that. So I'm just going to push the shadow over here, and then back behind here it is a little bit darker, so I'm just going to lightly go over some of that. All right, so that gave our apple a place. There's one little area I'm going to touch up, just a little bit of that table still showing. Then I'm just going to go back in and kind of touch up parts of the apple, like that was drying a little too light. And this area I'm just going to paint over because the lemon needs to look like it's in front of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that side. And I'm just going to put some marks of red kind of following the shape of the apple just to create a little bit of texture diversity and variety. All right, so there is the apple.